The first thing people remembered wasn't the shouting. It was the silence right before it, that thick, electric quiet that settles over a room when something that should never happen is about to happen anyway. A woman stood in the center of a courtroom aisle, her hands steady, her posture calm, her eyes fixed on a judge who had just made a mistake so large it would change the reputation of everyone present. Before we dive in, make sure to like and subscribe if you believe respect should be earned by truth, not assumed by appearances. Stories like this one remind us why that matters. Now, the moment the judge leaned forward to say the words that would ignite the entire room, he didn't know he was stepping onto a landmine, one disguised as a quiet 29-year-old woman named Elena Reyes. She stood there in a simple charcoal blouse and black slacks, the kind of outfit a federal contractor might wear on a rushed morning. But the stillness in her shoulders and the calm precision in her breathing betrayed something deeper, older, forged long before she ever stepped into a courthouse. The courtroom had been packed from the moment the doors opened. Tired parents clutching paperwork, defendants trying not to be noticed, attorneys whispering strategy, and in the middle of it all, Elena, waiting to give testimony on behalf of a terrified woman she barely knew but refused to abandon. She wasn't a lawyer, and she wasn't required to be there. But when she'd been asked to come as a witness for a young mother fleeing an abusive ex-partner, she didn't hesitate. People in danger was something she could never walk away from, not after the things she'd lived through. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, illuminating the faint circles under Elena's eyes, remnants of a late-night shift doing federal protective assignments, the kind of job that didn't pay enough and didn't let you sleep enough, but kept the country safely turning all the same. As case after case crawled forward, the judge's irritation became increasingly noticeable. He was a man used to being obeyed, used to people shrinking under his tone, used to the room bending to his authority. But Elena did not shrink. When the victim's attorney introduced her as a witness, the defense attorney, a tall man with slick hair, an expensive suit, and a practiced smirk, gave a condescending chuckle. "Your Honor," he said, "with all due respect, this witness is what? A security guard? How does that qualify her to make any determination about my client's behavior?" The whisper of laughter from a few spectators stung sharper than expected, but Elena didn't react. She'd faced worse. Dust storms in Bahrain that scraped your skin raw, sirens in the middle of the night signaling yet another attack on the port, and the brutal discipline of serving as a Navy master-at-arms from age 18 until she left the service at 26. If anything, the attorney's attempt at humiliation was amateur. The judge, growing increasingly impatient, leaned forward and squinted at her over the rim of his glasses. "Ms. Reyes, what exactly is your professional role? Please be brief." Elena answered steadily, her voice calm and level. "I'm a federal security specialist, Your Honor. I was the first responding officer during the incident in question." "Officer," the defense attorney mocked. "Your Honor, she's wearing a blouse from a department store. Hardly an officer." More chuckles. The judge exhaled sharply and waved a dismissive hand. "Ms. Reyes, do you have any formal law enforcement authority in this building?" "I'm here as a witness, sir," Elena replied. "My credentials," the judge repeated, his irritation sharpening. "Let me see them." Now, Elena reached into her bag calmly, producing her federal identification, an ID few civilians ever saw, issued only to those vetted for highly sensitive protective assignments in partnership with naval security forces. But the judge barely glanced at it before snapping. "This is not a law enforcement credential. Not in my courtroom. Bailiff, remove her badges." The room inhaled as one. Even the defense attorney's smirk faltered. The bailiff hesitated. That alone was telling. Something in Elena's steadiness gave him pause, a small instinct tugging at him that she was not someone to treat carelessly. But a judge's order was a judge's order. He stepped forward, reaching for her credentials. Elena did not move back. She didn't flare with emotion, didn't protest, didn't show even a flicker of fear. Instead, she gently pushed her sleeve back so her hands were free. And that was when the first clue slipped into view, unnoticed by the judge, but not by the two Navy veterans sitting in the back corner waiting for their own case. Ink, a design etched into her skin just above the wrist. A subdued trident wrapped around an anchor, interlocked with the silhouette of a service pistol. Their eyes widened. One whispered to the other under his breath, "That's not decorative. That's a security warfare mark, the kind you only get after certain deployments. But the judge saw none of this. He only saw a civilian woman daring to hold her ground. Ms. Reyes, he snapped. You are dangerously close to being held in contempt. You will surrender your badges. Elena exhaled once, a small controlled breath, the kind someone takes before walking into smoke. Your Honor, she said quietly. With respect, I believe you're making a mistake. That sentence, those 8 calm words, ignited something in the judge. He pounded the bench. Enough. Bailiff. And that was when the doors slammed open. It was not a normal entrance. The hinges rattled. The entire room jolted, and every head turned. A man in a deep navy uniform entered with the gravitational force of a tidal wave. Broad-shouldered, precise, his posture so sharp it seemed carved from steel. On his chest, the golden trident of a Navy SEAL. On his collar, the insignia of a full commander. And behind him, 2 federal agents wearing badges that gleamed under courtroom lights. The judge's voice died in his throat. The defense attorney went pale. And Elena Reyes, calm, still, disciplined, only blinked once, as though she had expected something like this all along. That moment was the beginning of the unraveling. The last breath before the room learned exactly who they had just tried to strip of everything she'd earned. The air inside the courtroom shifted the moment the SEAL commander stepped through the doors, as if the temperature dropped a few degrees, and every molecule in the room suddenly remembered it had a place to be. He didn't storm in with theatrics. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried the weight of operations no one in that courtroom could imagine, missions scrubbed from public record, the kind you only whispered about in secure rooms. His eyes were sharp, scanning instantly, assessing threats, gauging tension. They settled first on Elena, steady, unflinching, and something in his jaw tightened, not in anger at her, but in fury at what had been done. The judge tried to recover some semblance of authority, straightening his robe and clearing his throat, but the words that came out cracked slightly. Commander, this is a private proceeding. You can't simply. The commander held up one gloved hand, and the room went silent without him saying a word. Behind him, the federal agents took their places with quiet, lethal discipline, their eyes never leaving the judge, as though they were waiting for an order Elena herself couldn't hear. Then the commander stepped forward with a measured precision that reminded every veteran in the room of a man who had walked across hostile ground more times than anyone should have to. He stopped only a few feet from the judge's bench, his voice smooth but edged like a blade. Judge Morrison, he said, before you commit to your next action, I strongly advise you understand exactly who you are about to penalize. The judge bristled. This woman presented herself as someone with authority she does not possess. On the contrary, the commander cut in, not raising his voice, yet rendering the judge speechless. She possesses authority you couldn't begin to understand because it doesn't fit neatly into your courtroom paperwork. The defense attorney tried to interject, but one stern glance from the commander shut him up instantly. Then he turned back to Elena, and what he did next rippled through the room like a shockwave. He saluted her. A crisp, precise, regulation-perfect salute reserved for respect, acknowledgement, and recognition of someone who had earned it in blood and scars. Gasps echoed from the gallery. Elena didn't move for a moment. Her eyes flickered with something almost softer than usual, a quiet humility she rarely let surface. Then she returned the salute, short, controlled, proper. The commander faced the judge again, removing a sealed folder from his inner pocket. You attempted to confiscate federal law enforcement credentials from a decorated servicewoman, he said, placing the file on the bench with deliberate force. Here is who she is. The judge hesitated before opening it, but the moment he saw the first page, the color drained from his face. The documents were unmistakable. Deployment records stamped with Naval Security Forces insignia, commendations with embossed seals, citations written by senior officers. Security Reaction Team Leader, Naval Station Bahrain. The commander recited, his voice carrying across the room with the resonance of a well-trained briefing. Recipient of the Bronze Star with valor for neutralizing a bomber before he reached the port's fuel line. Awarded the Purple Heart for shielding 2 junior sailors during an explosive breach. Conducted evacuations under live fire. Completed classified protective operations stateside. And currently, he added with emphasis, serves as a federally appointed protective specialist whose credentials you tried to remove in front of a courtroom. The judge swallowed hard, the gavel shaking in his hand. I didn't know, he whispered, the humiliation settling into his expression like a heavy shade. The commander leaned closer. Your ignorance is not her burden. Your assumptions are not her fault. And your disrespect, he said, quiet but lethal, will not be tolerated. A thick silence fell, but it was different. Now, charged, reverent, and edged with guilt. Even the defense attorney bowed his head slightly, unable to continue pretending Elena was anything other than exceptional. The bailiff, who had been moments away from stripping her badges, lowered his gaze and stepped back with the kind of shame that stays with a person for a long time. Elena stood still through all of it, her composure unwavering, but her eyes softened as the commander turned back to her, speaking not as a superior, but as someone who understood the weight she carried. "Ma2 Reyes," he said. "You should have informed me you were appearing today." She shook her head gently. "Sir, I didn't think it was necessary." "Clearly," he replied, scanning the room, "it was." And as the judge sank deeper into his chair, fully confronted with the gravity of what he had attempted to do, the entire courtroom realized that the quiet young woman they had dismissed, mocked, doubted, and nearly humiliated was someone who had walked through fire long before she ever stepped into that building. Someone whose silence was not weakness, but discipline. Someone whose calm was not submission, but strength. And most importantly, someone who had earned every ounce of respect they had denied her. The judge's apology didn't begin so much as it collapsed out of him, like a structure giving way under its own flawed foundation. At first it was only a thin, fractured whisper, "Ms. Reyes." But then the reality of what he had nearly done crashed into him with humiliating force, dragging every syllable out as though it weighed 10 pounds each. "I grossly misjudged you," he managed, swallowing hard as the folder containing her service record trembled in his hands. "Your service, your sacrifices, your courage, had I known." But Elena, standing with the posture of someone who had been trained never to flinch, gently shook her head before he could finish the sentence. She wasn't rejecting the apology. She was refusing to let him hide behind the excuse of ignorance. "With respect," she said softly, "you shouldn't need to know my past to treat me with dignity in the present." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery, small, hesitant, ashamed, because many of them had been just as guilty as the judge. They had seen a quiet young woman in plain clothes and assumed modesty meant weakness, that calm meant lower rank. They didn't know that true strength rarely announced itself. It rested in the silence, in the discipline, in the steadiness forged far from any spotlight. The judge sank back slightly, his gavel hand shaking in a way he couldn't disguise. The bailiff shifted on his feet, unable to meet Elena's eyes. Even the defense attorney, whose smugness had carried the weight of arrogance earlier, now stood stiff and pale, his gaze glued to the floor as though hoping it might swallow him whole. But the commander stepped forward again, not to chastise or threaten this time, but to say what the room needed to hear, and what Elena would never speak for herself. "This woman," he said, gesturing to her with a quiet conviction that echoed through every corner of the courtroom, "has carried responsibilities few of you here could even comprehend. When she was 19, she dragged a wounded sailor out of a burning barracks while the ceiling came down around them. At 21, she stood between a bomber and 42 unarmed personnel. At 23, she evacuated civilians under live fire because she refused to leave anyone behind. And at 26, after 8 years of service, she transitioned into federal protective work not for glory or rank, but because keeping people safe is in her bones." The judge blinked hard, as though each fact struck him physically. The commander's voice softened only slightly as he leaned closer. "And you tried to humiliate her." A thick silence filled the room, not tense this time, but weighted with remorse, heavy enough to pull even the air downward. Elena stood quietly through all of it, not triumphant, not vindicated, merely steady. That was, in its own way, the most humbling part. She did not revel in her unexpected defenders or the stunned reverence around her. Her expression remained exactly as it had been from the start, calm, composed, dignified. As the judge cleared his throat, and stumbled through a formal reversal of his earlier command. Ms. Reyes, your credentials will not be confiscated. I apologize for my conduct. The commander turned slightly toward Elena and spoke in a low tone meant for her more than the room. You didn't deserve any of that, he said. You never have. Elena exhaled slowly. Not a sigh, just a release, controlled and measured. Sir, it's fine, she murmured. I've dealt with worse. The commander shook his head. You shouldn't have to. And it was in that moment, the acknowledgement, not the confrontation, that something inside the spectators shifted. One by one, people who had sat in judgment or indifference now watched her with a different kind of attention. Not all, respect. Genuine, earned, overdue respect. The young mother Elena had testified to help began to cry quietly into her hands, overwhelmed not just by relief, but by the revelation that someone like Elena, someone so extraordinary, had cared enough to fight for her. Elena caught her eye, offering a small, reassuring nod that seemed to say, "You're safe now. I'm still here." When the commander signaled for the agents to escort Elena out, they didn't flank her like security. They walked beside her like colleagues, equals. The crowd parted instinctively as she moved toward the exit, parting not from fear, but from reverence. Even the veterans in the back, men who had once faced wars of their own, stood straighter in her presence. She didn't look like the warrior they imagined. She didn't need to. Her strength wasn't measured in scars or medals or rank patches. It was measured in the way she stood when she was alone against a room full of authority and didn't break. Just before she crossed the threshold, Elena paused and looked back, not at the judge, not at the defense attorney, but at the room itself, the room that had tried to strip her down and was now standing in the wreckage of its assumptions. For the first time all morning, she spoke with a voice that carried more than discipline. It carried truth. Respect, she said quietly, isn't something you give because of a uniform. It's something you give because it's right. Then she stepped into the hallway, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. The doors closed behind her with a soft thud that felt like an ending and a reckoning. Out in the corridor, the commander walked alongside her, matching her pace with the easy familiarity of someone who had once walked beside her in far more dangerous places. You handled that better than most operators I've known, he said, eyes forward. Elena gave a faint, tired smile. Years of practice, sir. He huffed a small laugh. Still, you shouldn't have had to. They continued in silence for a few seconds, the kind of silence only people with shared history can sit in comfortably. Reyes, the commander added finally, gently, the world doesn't deserve people like you. Elena looked ahead, her expression calm but resolute. Maybe not, she said, but the people who need help do. And with that, she walked on. No spotlight, no applause, no uniform announcing who she was. Just a woman in her late 20s who commanded a room without raising her voice, who carried her honor not as a badge, but as a quiet truth. A woman who didn't need anyone to recognize her worth for it to exist. Because Elena Reyes was not remarkable because she had survived danger. She was remarkable because she never let it change who she protected. Even when the world tried to strip her of everything she'd earned, she stood tall, not for herself, but for others. And that, more than anything written in her record, was what made her unforgettable.